Did you know that in medieval London, the population was around 50,000 people? Imagine living in a city that's small by today's standards. Yet, despite its size, London was a bustling hub of activity, culture, and commerce. It was the largest city in England and a crucial center for trade, governance, and culture. Now, let's delve into the topic of daily life in medieval London. It wasn't all castles and knights. We're focusing on the common folk and the challenges they faced on a daily basis. Life in medieval London was no walk in the park. The people of that time had to deal with disease outbreaks, poor sanitation, and a rigid social hierarchy that dictated their every move. The streets were narrow and often filthy, filled with the sounds and smells of a city teeming with life. The city's layout was a maze of winding streets and alleys, many of which were unpaved and muddy. Houses were packed tightly together, often leaning over the streets, creating a claustrophobic atmosphere. Despite these conditions, London was a vibrant, thriving city. Picture streets alive with the chatter of vendors hawking their wares, the clang of blacksmiths' hammers, and the mingling scents of fresh bread and less pleasant odors from open sewers. Imagine cramped living quarters, noisy streets bustling with activity, and people toiling away in various trades to make ends meet. Bakers, blacksmiths, and merchants all played crucial roles in the economy, while markets were the heartbeat of the city. It was a tough life, but they made the best of it. The bakers rose early to prepare bread for the day, while blacksmiths labored in the heat of their forges, crafting tools and repairing items. Merchants, meanwhile, dealt with a myriad of goods, from local produce to exotic imports. One of the most remarkable aspects of medieval London was its vibrant trade. The River Thames was the lifeblood of the city, bringing goods and people from all over the known world. The docks were always busy, with ships unloading everything from spices and silk to timber and wine. London's position on the Thames made it a key player in international trade. The city's merchants formed powerful guilds, such as the Worshipful Company of Mercers, which dominated the import and export of goods. These guilds wielded significant influence, setting standards for trade and providing a network of support for their members. But let's not romanticize it too much. Daily life was fraught with challenges. For instance, sanitation was a significant issue. Waste disposal was rudimentary at best, with open sewers running down the streets. This, combined with the close quarters in which people lived, created a perfect breeding ground for disease. Most people relied on chamber pots, which were emptied into the streets or into the River Thames. The resulting stench was unbearable, and the risk of disease was ever present. The lack of proper sanitation led to frequent outbreaks of illnesses, and clean drinking water was a constant concern. Speaking of disease, one key moment that shaped daily life in medieval London was the outbreak of the Great Plague in 1348. This devastating event changed the city forever and left a lasting impact on its residents. The plague decimated the population, killing an estimated one-third of the city's inhabitants. It was a time of unimaginable horror and sorrow, but it also brought about significant social and economic changes. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out, leaving a profound mark on the city's demographic and social fabric. The Great Plague, also known as the Black Death, arrived in England in 1348 and quickly spread through London. The disease, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, was carried by fleas on rats. Symptoms included fever, chills, vomiting, and the appearance of painful buboes. The plague's rapid spread and high mortality rate caused widespread panic and social upheaval. The city's infrastructure struggled to cope with the sheer number of deaths, and many people turned to religion for comfort, believing the plague was a punishment from God. The psychological impact was immense, with fear and superstition dominating daily life. Despite these hardships, the people of medieval London showed incredible resilience. They adapted to their circumstances, finding ways to survive and even thrive. The city was home to numerous guilds, organizations that regulated trades and maintained standards. These guilds played a crucial role in the economic life of the city, providing support and protection for their members. The guilds were powerful and influential, with their own halls and chapels. They set standards for quality and training, controlled prices, and provided charity and support for their members. Guilds also fostered a sense of community and mutual aid among their members, helping them navigate the economic challenges of the time. Markets were vibrant centers of activity, where people from all walks of life came together. From the grand fairs of Smithfield to the everyday hustle and bustle of Cheapside, markets were the lifeblood of the city. Here, you could find everything from fresh produce to fine cloth, from exotic spices to everyday household items. The markets were noisy, bustling places, filled with the cries of vendors and the chatter of shoppers. They were also places where news and gossip were exchanged, making them vital hubs of communication. Markets were not just about commerce. They were social spaces where people met, exchanged information, and built community bonds. But what about home life? The typical medieval Londoner lived in a small, cramped house, often sharing space with extended family members. These homes were constructed from timber and wattle and daub, with thatched roofs that were prone to catching fire. Inside, they were dimly lit, with rushlights or tallow candles providing limited illumination. The hearth was the center of the home, where meals were prepared and families gathered. Diets were simple but hearty, consisting mainly of bread, pottage, and occasionally meat or fish. Fresh fruits and vegetables were available, but their consumption varied with the seasons. Most people drank ale or weak beer, as water was often contaminated. The alehouses were popular gathering places, where people could relax and socialize. The simplicity of their diet reflected the agricultural rhythms and local resources of the time. Education was a privilege few could afford. Most children were taught basic skills at home, while only the wealthier families could send their sons to grammar schools or employ tutors. For girls, education was even more limited, focusing primarily on domestic skills. However, some boys had the opportunity to attend schools run by monasteries or the church, where they could receive a more advanced education. These schools taught Latin, the language of the church and learning, as well as basic arithmetic and religious instruction. The curriculum reflected the needs of a society where literacy was rare and practical skills were highly valued. Religion played a central role in daily life. The church was a powerful institution, influencing every aspect of society. People attended regular services, observed numerous religious festivals, and sought the church's guidance in matters both spiritual and temporal. Monasteries and churches were not just places of worship, but also centers of learning and charity. The church provided education, healthcare, and support for the poor and needy. Pilgrimages were common, with Londoners traveling to revered sites such as Canterbury or even further afield to Santiago de Compostela. These journeys were acts of faith and devotion, undertaken to seek divine favor or penance. The church also played a key role in the legal system, with church courts handling matters such as wills, marriages, and moral offenses. The church's influence extended into every aspect of life, shaping moral values and social norms. Maintaining law and order was another crucial aspect of medieval life. The city had its own system of courts and officials, including the infamous watchmen, who patrolled the streets at night. Crime and punishment were harsh by today's standards, with public executions and corporal punishment serving as deterrents. The legal system was based on a combination of local customs and royal edicts, with cases heard by local justices or royal judges. The most serious crimes, such as murder or treason, were tried by the king's courts and could result in severe punishments, including execution. Public executions were both a form of punishment and a grim spectacle, intended to reinforce social order and deter crime. The social hierarchy was rigid, with a clear division between the nobility, the clergy, and the commoners. This hierarchy dictated one's place in society and influenced every aspect of life, from legal rights to economic opportunities. The nobility owned most of the land and held significant political power, while the clergy wielded spiritual authority. The commoners, who made up the majority of the population, had limited rights and opportunities but played a crucial role in the city's economy and society. This hierarchical structure reinforced social stability but also limited social mobility and perpetuated economic disparities. In conclusion, the people of medieval London showed incredible resilience and adaptability in the face of adversity. They may have faced countless challenges, but they never gave up. Their ingenuity and determination laid the foundations for the vibrant, diverse city that London would become in later centuries. Before we wrap up, we encourage you to explore more about medieval history. Check out our other videos on the channel or share your thoughts and questions in the comments below, and please help our channel grow by subscribing. We love hearing from you. Thanks for joining us on this journey through medieval London. Stay curious. Know about the daily life of an Anglo-Saxon peasant? Was it solitary, nasty, brutish, and short? Or should we take a more nuanced view of the lives of Anglo-Saxon peasants? The Anglo-Saxon period in England, roughly spanning from the 5th century until the Norman Conquest in 1066, was marked by significant social, economic, and cultural changes. While much of the historical narrative focuses on kings, nobles, and warriors, the vast majority of the population consisted of peasants who lived and worked in rural settings. This essay delves into the daily life of an Anglo-Saxon peasant, exploring their economic activities, social structures, religious beliefs, and cultural practices. By examining archaeological evidence, historical records, and contemporary literature, we can gain a deeper understanding of the lived experiences of these often overlooked individuals. Economic activities and agricultural practices. Subsistence farming. The primary economic activity of Anglo-Saxon peasants was subsistence farming. Most peasants lived in small villages or hamlets, each surrounded by fields that were collectively known as the tun or ham. The land was typically organized into strips, with each family cultivating several strips in different fields. This system, known as open field farming, allowed for crop rotation, which was essential for maintaining soil fertility. The main crops grown included wheat, barley, oats, and rye, which provided the staples for the Anglo-Saxon diet, livestock, and animal husbandry. In addition to crop cultivation, livestock played a crucial role in the economy and daily life of Anglo-Saxon peasants. Commonly raised animals included cattle, sheep, pigs, and chickens. Cattle were particularly valuable, not only for their meat but also for their milk, which could be processed into butter and cheese. Sheep were prized for their wool, which was a vital resource for clothing and trade. Pigs were relatively easy to raise and could be allowed to forage in woodlands, providing a valuable source of protein. Seasonal activities and labor. The agricultural calendar dictated much of the daily and seasonal rhythms of life. Planting, tending, and harvesting crops were labor-intensive activities that required the cooperation of the entire community. Plowing typically began in early spring, followed by sowing. Weeding and maintenance occupied the summer months, and harvesting occurred in late summer to early autumn. After the harvest, the fields were often used for grazing livestock. Winter was a time for maintenance work, such as repairing tools and buildings, and for indoor activities like spinning and weaving. Social structure and community life. Village organization. The social structure of Anglo-Saxon villages was hierarchical, yet communal in nature. At the top of the local hierarchy were the free peasants, known as ceorl, who owned their own land or leased it from a lord. They had certain legal rights and responsibilities, including participation in the local moot, assembly, and the obligation to pay taxes or provide military service. Below the ceorl were the jeber or genete, tenant farmers who worked the land in exchange for protection and a share of the produce. At the bottom were the theos or slaves, who had the least rights and performed the most laborious tasks. Roles and responsibilities. The roles and responsibilities within the village were divided along lines of gender and age. Men typically handled heavy agricultural work, such as plowing and harvesting, as well as responsibilities like constructing buildings and maintaining defenses. Women were primarily responsible for domestic tasks, including cooking, spinning, weaving, and child-rearing. However, women also participated in agricultural activities, especially during peak seasons. Children contributed by tending animals, gathering wood, and assisting in household chores. Community and festivities. Despite the hard work and rigid social structure, community life offered opportunities for socialization and recreation. Festivals and religious observances were key aspects of community life, providing occasions for feasting, music, and games. Notable celebrations included those marking the agricultural calendar, such as harvest festivals, as well as Christian holy days after the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons. These events helped to strengthen community bonds and provided a break from the routine of daily labor. Religion and beliefs. Pagan tradition. The early Anglo-Saxons practiced a form of Germanic paganism, characterized by the worship of gods and goddesses associated with natural forces and daily life. Key deities included Woden, Odin, the chief god associated with war and wisdom, Thunor, Thor, the god of thunder and storms, and Frigg, Frigg, the goddess of fertility and love. Rituals and sacrifices were conducted to appease these deities and seek their favor for good harvests, fertility, and protection. Conversion to Christianity. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity began in the late 6th century with the mission of St. Augustine, sent by Pope Gregory the Great. The process was gradual, with many communities maintaining pagan practices alongside Christian ones for some time. The church became a central institution in village life, influencing not only religious practices but also social and economic activities. Monasteries and churches served as centers of learning, literacy, and charity, and the church calendar introduced new feasts and observances. Folk beliefs and superstitions. In addition to formal religious practices, Anglo-Saxon peasants held a variety of folk beliefs and superstitions. These included beliefs in spirits and supernatural creatures, such as elves and wights, which were thought to inhabit the natural world. Folk medicine and charms were commonly used to ward off illness or bring good fortune. The blending of pagan and Christian elements often resulted in unique local customs and practices. Housing and material culture. Housing structures. Anglo-Saxon peasants lived in simple wooden houses, typically constructed from locally available materials such as timber, wattle, and daub. The houses were generally single-room structures with thatched roofs and earthen floors. The hearth was the central feature of the home, providing warmth, light, and a place for cooking. Furniture was sparse, usually consisting of wooden benches, tables, and beds made from straw mattresses. Clothing and personal adornment. Clothing was made primarily from wool and linen, materials produced from the village's own resources. Men typically wore tunics and trousers, while women wore long dresses and cloaks. Both men and women might wear leather belts and simple jewelry, such as brooches or beads, depending on their status and wealth. Footwear was usually made from leather. The colors and quality of clothing varied, with natural dyes used to produce various hues. Tools and utensils. The tools and utensils used by Anglo-Saxon peasants were primarily made from wood, iron, and bone. Agricultural tools included plows, hoes, sickles, and scythes, while household utensils comprised wooden bowls, clay pots, and iron cooking implements. The craftsmanship of these items could vary significantly, with some being quite basic and others showing a high degree of skill and artistry. The use of tools and utensils was closely tied to the daily routines of farming, cooking, and crafting. Diet and cuisine. Staples and diet composition. The diet of Anglo-Saxon peasants was largely based on what they could grow and raise themselves. Bread made from wheat or barley was a staple, accompanied by pottage, a thick stew made from vegetables, grains, and occasionally meat. The diet was supplemented with dairy products such as cheese and butter, and during times of abundance, meat from livestock or game. Fish and seafood were also consumed, especially in coastal and riverine areas. Cooking and food preservation. Cooking was typically done over an open hearth, with food either boiled in pots or roasted on spits. Bread was baked in simple clay ovens or on flat stones. Preservation methods included salting, smoking, and drying, which were essential for ensuring a food supply during the winter months. Fermented foods and beverages, such as ale and mead, were common and often safer to drink than water, which could be contaminated. Feast and famine. The diet and food availability of Anglo-Saxon peasants were closely tied to the agricultural cycle and environmental conditions. Good harvests meant plentiful food and the possibility of feasting, while poor harvests could lead to scarcity and famine. Seasonal variation also played a role, with certain foods being more available at different times of the year. Social status could influence diet quality, with wealthier peasants and landowners having access to a more varied and nutritious diet. Education and literacy. Oral tradition and storytelling. The majority of Anglo-Saxon peasants were illiterate, and knowledge and culture were primarily transmitted through oral traditions. Storytelling was a key aspect of cultural life, with tales of heroes, gods, and historical events being passed down through generations. These stories often contained moral lessons or practical knowledge, such as farming techniques or local lore. The role of the church in education. The Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England brought an increase in literacy, primarily within the clergy and the monastic communities. Monasteries often maintained scriptoria where manuscripts were copied and produced, and they played a significant role in the education of the nobility and clergy. For peasants, however, direct access to education remained limited. The church did, however, influence the moral and ethical education of the community through sermons and religious instruction. Conclusion. The daily life of an Anglo-Saxon peasant was characterized by hard work, community involvement, and a close relationship with the natural world. While their lives were often marked by economic challenges and social limitations, peasants also played a crucial role in the agricultural and economic systems of medieval England. Their culture was rich in tradition, shaped by a blend of pagan and Christian beliefs, and reflected in their housing, clothing, and diet. Understanding the lives of Anglo-Saxon peasants provides valuable insight into the broader social and cultural history of early medieval England, highlighting the resilience and resourcefulness of these often overlooked members of society. Thanks for listening. Like and comment, and please subscribe as that will help us get more videos out to those interested in the Middle Ages. See you next time on Medieval Chronicles 1066 and stay curious.
Welcome to Medieval Chronicles 1066. In this series, an in-depth exploration of the diverse lives of various social classes in medieval England is undertaken. This episode will focus on the peasantry, a demographic that constituted the majority of the population and whose labor was indispensable for sustaining the societal structure of the time. In medieval England, one's social status influenced nearly every aspect of life. It determined the food consumed, travel limitations, level of education, and even life expectancy. This episode will delve into the lives of peasants, those who toiled relentlessly in the fields to ensure the survival of their communities and the grand estates they served. The feudal system was the dominant social and economic structure of medieval England, fundamentally shaping the lives of peasants. This system was based on the hierarchical relationship between the king, nobles, knights, and peasants, all bound by mutual obligations and duties. At the apex of this hierarchy was the king, who owned all the land and granted portions of it, known as fiefs, to his most loyal subjects, the nobles. In return for this land, the nobles, or barons, pledged military service, loyalty, and financial support to the king. The nobles, in turn, granted smaller portions of their land to knights, who swore to defend the realm and the nobles' interests. These knights managed the land and the peasants who worked it. In this way, the land was parceled out in a cascading hierarchy, with each level owing service and allegiance to the one above. At the base of the feudal pyramid were the peasants, who worked the land. There were various categories of peasants, including freemen, who paid rent for their land, and villeins or serfs, who were bound to the land and owed labor services to their lords. This relationship between lords and peasants was reciprocal. The lord provided protection and justice, while the peasants provided labor and a portion of their produce. The early Middle Ages, spanning from approximately 500 to 1000 AD, was a period of transformation following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. During this era, England saw the establishment of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The lives of peasants in these nascent kingdoms were characterized by subsistence farming and local trade. King Alfred the Great, who reigned from 871 to 899, is renowned for his efforts to defend his kingdom against Viking invasions and for his administrative reforms. Alfred's legal and educational reforms indirectly impacted the peasantry by promoting a more organized and stable society. He encouraged the establishment of burhs, fortified settlements that served as centers of local trade and defense, thereby providing some measure of security for the rural populace. During the early Middle Ages, the open field system began to take root. Peasants worked on strips of land in large communal fields, a system that facilitated cooperative farming and resource sharing. The manorial system also emerged, with peasants, often serfs, working on the lord's domain in exchange for protection and the right to cultivate their own plots of land. The manorial system established a hierarchical relationship between lords and peasants. The lord of the manor held significant power, but his responsibilities included providing justice and protection. Peasants, while bound to the land, had certain rights to their own plots, which they could pass down to their descendants. The Viking invasions in the 9th and 10th centuries brought both turmoil and opportunities. The constant threat of raids forced communities to band together for mutual protection, but it also disrupted agricultural cycles and led to periods of famine. Over time, however, some Vikings settled and integrated into local societies, contributing to cultural and economic exchanges. The church played a pivotal role in the lives of early medieval peasants. Churches and monasteries were not only spiritual centers but also hubs of learning and charity. Monastic lands were often cultivated by local peasants, and religious festivals provided breaks from the arduous agricultural calendar. While major peasant revolts were less common in the early Middle Ages, there were instances of local uprisings. These were usually prompted by oppressive taxation or excessive demands from landlords. The outcomes varied, with some revolts leading to temporary concessions while others were brutally suppressed, reinforcing the power of the feudal lords. The High Middle Ages, from 1000 to 1300, witnessed significant agricultural, social, and economic changes. The Norman Conquest of 1066, led by William the Conqueror, had profound effects on the English peasantry. William's reign, from 1066 to 1087, saw the implementation of the feudal system, which further formalized the obligations and duties of peasants to their lords. One of William's most notable legacies is the Domesday Book, completed in 1086. This extensive survey documented landholdings and resources across England, providing a detailed account of the peasant population and their economic activities. The Domesday Book reveals the extent of land under cultivation and the various obligations owed by peasants, such as labor services and rents. The High Middle Ages also saw technological advancements in agriculture. The introduction of the heavy plough and the three-field system increased productivity. The three-field system, which rotated crops to maintain soil fertility, allowed for more efficient use of land and led to surplus production. This surplus enabled trade and the growth of markets, gradually improving the economic conditions of some peasants. King Henry II, reigning from 1154 to 1189, implemented significant legal reforms that affected the peasantry. The development of common law under Henry II provided a more uniform and predictable legal framework. While primarily benefiting the nobility and townspeople, these reforms indirectly influenced peasants by creating a more stable and orderly society. The expansion of markets during the High Middle Ages provided peasants with new opportunities to sell their surplus produce and crafts. Market towns grew, and some peasants, through hard work and ingenuity, were able to improve their social and economic status. The growth of trade also contributed to the rise of a merchant class, further diversifying the social structure. The reign of King John, from 1199 to 1216, is often associated with the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215. While the Magna Carta primarily addressed the concerns of the nobility and church, its broader implications eventually impacted all levels of society, including the peasantry. The document's emphasis on the rule of law and protections against arbitrary actions by the king laid the groundwork for future legal reforms. During the High Middle Ages, there were several significant peasant uprisings. One notable example is the revolt led by Hereward the Wake against William the Conqueror in the late 11th century. Though ultimately unsuccessful, such revolts highlighted the peasants' dissatisfaction with oppressive feudal practices and excessive taxation. The suppression of these revolts often led to even harsher measures, demonstrating the delicate balance of power between lords and peasants. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, convened by Pope Innocent III, also had implications for the peasantry. The council's decrees on marriage, tithes, and heresy affected daily life and reinforced the church's influence over the populace. The requirement for annual confession and communion increased the church's moral oversight, impacting social norms and personal behavior. The late Middle Ages, from 1300 to 1500, were marked by significant upheavals and challenges. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, caused by excessive rain and poor harvests, led to widespread starvation and highlighted the vulnerability of the peasant class. This period of hardship was followed by the Black Death, which decimated the population of Europe between 1347 and 1351. During the reign of King Edward III, from 1327 to 1377, the Black Death had profound effects on English society. The dramatic reduction in population led to labor shortages, which in turn increased the bargaining power of peasants. Many landlords, desperate for labor, offered better terms to attract workers. This shift began to undermine the feudal system, as peasants sought higher wages and better working conditions. One of the most significant events of the late Middle Ages was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, during the reign of King Richard II. This revolt was fueled by economic hardship, high taxes, and oppressive labor laws. Led by figures such as Wat Tyler and John Ball, the peasants demanded the abolition of serfdom, fair rents, and the end of oppressive labor practices. Although the revolt was eventually suppressed, it forced the young King Richard II to confront the grievances of the lower classes. The rebellion also accelerated the decline of serfdom in England. The reign of King Henry IV, from 1399 to 1413, saw continued social and economic changes. The aftermath of the Black Death and subsequent labor shortages led to increased mobility among peasants. Many were able to negotiate better terms or move to towns and cities in search of work. The decline of feudal obligations and the rise of a more market-oriented economy gradually transformed rural society. The Wars of the Roses, a series of civil wars for control of the throne of England, from 1455 to 1487, further impacted the peasantry. The conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York disrupted agricultural production and caused widespread devastation. Many peasants were drawn into the conflict either through conscription or as mercenaries, further highlighting their importance in the broader societal struggles. The late Middle Ages also witnessed continued advancements in farming techniques and tools, further increasing agricultural productivity. Innovations such as improved plowing methods and the use of crop rotation helped sustain the peasant economy despite the challenges posed by climatic fluctuations and social disruptions. By the late Middle Ages, the traditional feudal system was giving way to early forms of a market economy. The commutation of labor services for monetary rents became more common, allowing peasants greater freedom to manage their own time and resources. This shift laid the foundation for the transformation of the English countryside and the rise of a more mobile and economically diverse rural population. Women in peasant communities played crucial roles in both household management and agricultural labor. They were responsible for tasks such as spinning, weaving, brewing, and caring for livestock. Despite their contributions, women often had limited legal rights and were subject to the authority of their husbands or fathers. The late Middle Ages saw some improvement in women's legal status, particularly through widowhood, which granted them more autonomy over property and business dealings. The late Middle Ages also experienced significant religious changes, including the rise of movements like Lollardy, which criticized the wealth and corruption of the church. These movements sometimes found support among peasants, who were disillusioned with the established religious order. The suppression of such movements highlighted the tension between the desire for reform and the existing power structures. Despite their crucial role, the contributions of medieval peasants have often been overlooked. It was not until 2015 that a memorial for the peasant revolt was erected in London. This recognition is a small step toward acknowledging the significance of the peasant class in medieval history. Peasants were the foundation of medieval society, providing the labor and produce that sustained both noble and religious establishments. Their stories of resilience, innovation, and occasional rebellion are essential to understanding the complexities of medieval life. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the lives of medieval peasants. Be sure to check out our other videos on life and significant events in the Middle Ages and share your thoughts in the comments below. Please help out our channel by liking and subscribing to Medieval Chronicles 1066, a YouTube channel dedicated to bringing you more fascinating medieval history documentaries. The real reason for the Peasant Revolt of 1381, economic grievances, political discontent, and social change in late medieval England. The Peasant Revolt of 1381, also known as the Great Rising, stands as one of the most pivotal uprisings in medieval England. Traditionally portrayed as a spontaneous outburst of anger against feudal oppression, the revolt saw thousands of peasants, artisans, and lower-ranking members of society rise up against the government. Historians have often attributed the rebellion to the imposition of a poll tax by the young King Richard II's government. However, a closer examination reveals that the revolt was not simply a reaction to a single tax or a spontaneous explosion of discontent, but rather the culmination of a complex interplay of economic grievances, political discontent, and social changes that had been brewing for decades. The English peasant revolt of 1381 was not an isolated incident. Similar revolts occurred across Europe in the late 14th century, reflecting widespread social and economic unrest. In France, the Jacquerie of 1358 saw peasants rise against their lords, while the Ciompi revolt of 1378 in Florence demonstrated the discontent of lower urban classes. These continental parallels suggest that the peasant revolt in England was part of a broader pattern of upheaval during a period of crisis and transition across Europe. England's specific circumstances, however, were shaped by unique factors such as its ongoing war with France, the political power struggles within its ruling elite, and the specific economic and social pressures resulting from the Black Death. Understanding these elements helps clarify why the revolt of 1381 took the shape it did and reveals deeper insights into the evolution of English society during a critical period of transition. Economic grievances, the root of discontent. Economic grievances were at the core of the peasant revolt of 1381. The late 14th century was marked by severe economic hardship for many of England's lower classes. The immediate cause of the revolt was the imposition of a third poll tax within 4 years, designed to raise funds for the war against France. Unlike previous taxes, the poll tax was a flat levy, meaning that every adult, regardless of wealth, had to pay the same amount. This regressive nature of the tax made it especially burdensome for the poor. When government agents attempted to enforce collection rigorously, they provoked widespread anger and resistance, particularly in the southeastern counties of Kent and Essex. However, the anger over the poll tax was only the surface of much deeper economic discontent. The roots of economic frustration lay in the cumulative impact of decades of economic policies and crises. The Black Death of 1348 to 1350 had decimated England's population, killing between 1/3 and 1/2 of its inhabitants. This demographic catastrophe had profound economic consequences, including a severe labor shortage that led to increased wages. The peasants, who had been bound to the land through feudal obligations, now saw an opportunity to negotiate better terms with their landlords or move to other areas offering higher wages. This newly acquired leverage, however, was met with resistance from the ruling elite. In response, laws like the Statute of Labourers of 1351 were enacted to keep wages at pre-Black Death levels and restrict the movement of workers. These statutes were vigorously enforced, with local justices being given wide-ranging powers to impose fines and other penalties on those who violated wage limits. Records from local courts show a considerable number of prosecutions under these laws, particularly in areas like East Anglia and the Midlands, where tensions were already high. The legislation was deeply resented, as it appeared to deny the peasants the natural benefits of a reduced labor force. The attempt to enforce pre-plague economic conditions in a post-plague world fostered a sense of injustice and frustration among the peasantry, who viewed these laws as an affront to their hard-won gains in the labor market. Furthermore, the period saw a gradual shift from traditional feudal dues, like labor services, to cash rents. While this change might seem beneficial, as it provided a more flexible form of tenure, it also exposed peasants to new forms of economic vulnerability. Peasants who could not afford these cash payments often fell into debt, and local records reveal a growing number of cases where peasants lost their lands or goods due to unpaid rents. Lords, seeking to maximize income, became increasingly harsh in their collection of rents and other dues. In some regions, they attempted to reimpose labor services or claim other traditional rights that had fallen into disuse, leading to bitter disputes and confrontations. In Kent and Essex, where the revolt began, the situation was further aggravated by the enforcement of villenage, or hereditary servitude tied to the land. Many lords, faced with rising labor costs, sought to tighten control over their villeins, enforcing old obligations or imposing new restrictions. The renewed efforts to enforce villenage sparked widespread anger, as many peasants believed they were entitled to freedom based on the evolving economic conditions and the perceived promise of ancient liberties. The intensity of resistance varied by region, but the southeast, with its strong tradition of local independence and relatively large numbers of free peasants, proved to be particularly volatile. By the late 1370s, a significant portion of the peasant population felt squeezed by economic changes that promised freedom but instead delivered new forms of exploitation. Political discontent and the failure of governance. Economic grievances were intertwined with a growing sense of political discontent and frustration with the ruling elite. The late 14th century was a period of intense political instability in England. The young King Richard II, who ascended to the throne in 1377, was surrounded by a coterie of unpopular advisers, including his uncle John of Gaunt. This ruling circle was widely perceived as corrupt and self-serving, accused of mismanaging the war with France, imposing heavy taxes, and enriching themselves at the expense of the common people. The resentment was not confined to the upper echelons of power. Many peasants and townsfolk resented the erosion of local autonomy and the increasing intrusion of royal officials into their lives. The frequent imposition of special commissions to enforce tax collection, such as the poll tax, was seen as a direct attack on traditional local rights and privileges. In many instances, these officials acted in arbitrary and oppressive ways, using their positions to extract bribes, impose fines, and enrich themselves. The chronic abuses of power by local and royal officials generated a profound sense of betrayal among the populace. Moreover, the peasantry felt that the royal government had failed to fulfill its fundamental obligations to protect and provide justice for its subjects. The ongoing and costly Hundred Years' War against France drained England's resources and led to repeated demands for taxation. Yet, many perceived the war as a series of costly failures that benefited only a narrow elite. Additionally, there was widespread dissatisfaction with the judicial system, which seemed biased in favor of the wealthy and powerful. Royal courts were seen as denying justice to common people in their dealings with landlords, merchants, and other elites, exacerbating a sense of alienation and resentment. The role of radical clerics like John Bull cannot be underestimated in shaping the political dimensions of the revolt. Bull, a priest who had been excommunicated and imprisoned multiple times for his inflammatory sermons, was a vocal critic of the social and political order. He preached a proto-socialist message, calling for the overthrow of the existing hierarchy and the establishment of a more egalitarian society. His famous rhetorical question, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" resonated with many who saw the existing social hierarchy as fundamentally unjust. Bull's sermons, circulated through secret networks, helped to articulate a coherent ideological framework for the revolt, transforming it from a series of local protests into a broader movement with social and political goals. Local instances of unrest before 1381 further illustrate the growing political discontent. In 1377, there were reports of disturbances in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire over the imposition of new taxes, and in the same year, anti-clerical riots broke out in London, reflecting a general frustration with both secular and ecclesiastical authorities. These earlier protests served as precursors to the larger uprising in 1381, providing a foundation of resistance and a network of communication that would prove critical once the revolt began in earnest. The failure of governance also extended to Richard II's response to the immediate outbreak of the revolt. The government's attempts to enforce the poll tax, for example, were marked by inconsistencies and heavy-handed tactics that only served to inflame tensions. The Royal Council's decision to deploy commissioners to investigate tax evasion led to violent confrontations in Kent and Essex, where local communities resisted what they saw as the unjust imposition of a flawed tax system. The government's inability to anticipate the scale of resistance and its failure to respond effectively to early signs of discontent revealed a profound disconnect between the ruling elite and the common people. Social change and the decline of feudalism. The economic and political grievances that fueled the peasant revolt were closely linked to broader social changes taking place in late medieval England. One of the most significant of these changes was the gradual decline of the feudal system. By the late 14th century, the rigid social hierarchies that had characterized medieval society for centuries were beginning to break down. The Black Death had created a labor shortage that allowed many peasants to improve their social and economic positions. Some were able to negotiate better terms with their landlords, purchase their own land, or move to towns and cities in search of better opportunities. The demographic and economic changes of the 14th century thus led to a growing sense of social mobility and aspiration among the lower classes. This shift was particularly noticeable among free peasants or yeomen, who were no longer bound to the land and had some degree of economic independence. These individuals were often more educated and politically aware than their forebears and increasingly willing to challenge the social status quo. For instance, court records from the period reveal numerous instances of peasants bringing lawsuits against their landlords, challenging unfair practices or seeking to protect their newly acquired freedoms. The decline of traditional feudal relations also reshaped rural communities. Many villages were transitioning from tightly controlled feudal estates to more loosely organized communities of independent or semi-independent tenants. This shift created new tensions, as those who had gained some degree of independence resented continued attempts by landlords to enforce old feudal obligations. At the same time, those who remained tied to the land as serfs or villeins saw the opportunities available to their free counterparts and grew more dissatisfied with their lack of freedom. Urban centers played a critical role in fostering this discontent and nurturing a sense of collective action. Many leaders of the peasant revolt, including Wat Tyler, had connections to towns and cities where ideas about freedom, rights, and resistance to authority were more openly discussed. The urban environment, especially in London, provided fertile ground for revolutionary ideas to spread. Londoners were particularly discontented with the heavy-handed rule of city authorities and the corruption of the royal government. The rebels marched to London and their occupation of the city were significant acts, reflecting both the symbolic and practical importance of the capital in the revolt strategy. The broader social changes of the period thus contributed to a heightened sense of injustice and dissatisfaction with the status quo. The lower classes, who were beginning to perceive themselves as entitled to certain rights and freedoms, were no longer willing to accept their traditional place in society. They began to demand a greater say in governance and a fairer distribution of resources and opportunities. These demands, while not always articulated in clear or consistent terms, reflected a deepening consciousness of social inequality and a willingness to challenge the existing order. Revolutionary ideology or pragmatic rebellion. Historians have long debated whether the peasant revolt of 1381 was driven by a coherent revolutionary ideology or whether it was a more pragmatic response to immediate grievances. Some scholars, particularly those writing in the 19th and early 20th centuries, saw the revolt as an early expression of class consciousness and a precursor to later revolutionary movements. They pointed to the radical rhetoric of leaders like John Ball and the rebels' demands for the abolition of serfdom, the reduction of taxes, and the end of the privileges of the nobility and clergy as evidence of a nascent revolutionary ideology. More recent historians, however, have argued that the revolt was less ideologically driven and more a pragmatic response to specific grievances. They suggest that the rebels' demands were shaped primarily by their immediate circumstances and that their actions were motivated by a desire for justice and redress rather than by any grand revolutionary vision. For example, while the rebels demanded the abolition of serfdom, this was often framed in terms of the restoration of ancient liberties rather than the creation of a new social order. Similarly, Their calls for the removal of evil counsellors from the king's government were rooted in a traditional belief in the king's responsibility to govern justly, rather than a rejection of monarchy itself. Comparing the peasant revolt of 1381 with other contemporary uprisings, such as the Jacquerie in France, 1358, and the Ciompi revolt in Florence, 1378, reveals both similarities and differences that can help contextualize the English revolt. Like the English rebels, the French peasants rose against what they perceived as exploitation by the nobility, fueled by economic hardship and political failures. However, the Jacquerie was characterized by extreme violence and lacked a coherent program beyond immediate destruction. In contrast, the English revolt was more organized, with articulated demands and specific targets, suggesting a more developed political consciousness. The Ciompi revolt in Florence, involving lower urban classes demanding a greater share of political power and economic justice, shares more similarities with the peasant revolt in England. Both involved organized movements that sought to reform existing systems rather than overthrow them entirely. However, the English revolt had a broader base, encompassing both rural and urban elements, and was driven by a combination of economic, social, and political grievances that reflected the unique conditions of late medieval England. While the peasant revolt of 1381 may not have been revolutionary in the modern sense, it clearly represented a significant challenge to the existing social and political order. The rebels' willingness to march on London, attack royal officials, and execute unpopular figures like Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Robert Hales, the treasurer, demonstrated a level of organization and determination that went far beyond mere spontaneous protest. The uprising's rapid spread across southern and eastern England suggests a level of coordination and communication that implies a degree of ideological coherence, even if this was not always fully articulated. The role of leadership and local dynamics. The success of the peasant revolt in 1381 can also be attributed to effective leadership and the specific local dynamics that shaped the course of the rebellion. Wat Tyler, who emerged as the leader of the Kentish rebels, played a crucial role in organizing and directing the revolt. Tyler's leadership was characterized by charisma, tactical acumen, and an ability to articulate the grievances of the common people. His demands for the end of serfdom, the abolition of feudal services, and the removal of corrupt officials resonated deeply with a discontented populace, allowing him to galvanize support quickly. Local dynamics also played a critical role in the uprising. The counties of Kent and Essex, where the revolt began, had long been areas of tension and resistance to seigneurial control. In these regions, many peasants had already experienced a degree of autonomy and freedom from manorial obligations, and there was a strong tradition of local resistance to external authority. When government officials attempted to enforce the unpopular poll tax, they encountered fierce resistance from communities already resentful of outside interference. The arrest of village leaders by royal agents was often the spark that ignited rebellion in these areas, as local communities rallied to defend their autonomy and protest against what they saw as unjust and oppressive measures. The revolt spread to other areas, such as East Anglia, the Midlands, and the Thames Valley, further highlights the role of local dynamics. In East Anglia, for example, the revolt was fueled by long-standing grievances against the practices of local landlords and the corruption of royal officials. The rebellion there took on a particularly violent character, with attacks on manorial records and the destruction of property, reflecting a deep-seated anger at the local manifestations of feudal control. In the Midlands, the rebellion intersected with pre-existing tensions between townspeople and local elites, demonstrating the ways in which local grievances could feed into a broader movement of revolt. Conclusion: the real reason for the peasant revolt of 1381. The peasant revolt of 1381 was not merely the result of a single tax or a sudden outburst of anger. It was a complex and multifaceted movement rooted in a wide array of economic, political, and social factors. The revolt was sparked by immediate grievances, such as the imposition of the poll tax and the arbitrary actions of royal officials, but these were only the final straws that broke the camel's back. Beneath the surface, the rebellion was fueled by deeper structural changes, including the economic hardships imposed by the Black Death, the social tensions arising from the decline of feudalism, and the political dissatisfaction with the governance of King Richard II's regime. While the revolt did not achieve all its aims and was ultimately suppressed, it left a lasting legacy. The uprising forced the ruling elite to reconsider their policies and contributed to the gradual erosion of feudal structures in England. It also highlighted the growing assertiveness of the lower classes and their willingness to challenge the established social and political order. As such, the Peasant Revolt of 1381 can be seen as a pivotal moment in the long-term development of English society, one that reflected the complex interplay of economic forces, political tensions, and social changes that characterized the late medieval period. The long-term effects of the revolt were profound, influencing future conflicts and reforms. The revolt demonstrated the potential power of the lower classes to force change, a lesson that would be remembered in subsequent centuries during events such as the Wars of the Roses and the English Reformation. The revolt also contributed to a gradual shift in the relationship between the monarchy and its subjects, highlighting the need for a more responsive and just governance. In the broader evolution of social and political thought in late medieval and early modern England, the Peasant Revolt helped lay the groundwork for future debates about authority, rights, and justice. In conclusion, the real reason for the Peasant Revolt of 1381 was not a single cause, but a combination of factors that had been building for decades. It was a movement that, while not revolutionary in the modern sense, nevertheless represented a significant challenge to the established order and paved the way for the profound transformations that would shape England in the centuries to come. Thanks for listening. Like and comment. And please subscribe, as that will help us get more videos out to those interested in the Middle Ages. See you next time on Medieval Chronicles 1066. Stay curious.
What do you know about life in medieval England under the feudal system? 1066 to 1485. Medieval England, spanning from the Norman Conquest in 1066 to the end of the Wars of the Roses in 1485, witnessed profound transformations in its social, political, and economic structures. Central to these changes was the feudal system, introduced and entrenched by William the Conqueror, which defined land ownership, social hierarchy, and the daily lives of the English population for centuries. Let's explore what life was like in medieval England under the feudal system, examining the roles of different social classes, the structure of the feudal society, the impact of the manor court and forest law, and the evolution of education and social status during this period. The Norman Conquest and the establishment of feudalism. The Norman Conquest of 1066 was a turning point in English history, not only because it brought a new ruling dynasty, but also because it fundamentally altered the country's land ownership and governance structures. William the Conqueror, after his victory at the Battle of Hastings, sought to consolidate his power by introducing the feudal system, a hierarchical structure that dictated land ownership and the obligations of different social classes. Under this system, William claimed all land in England as the crown's property. He redistributed vast tracts of land to his Norman supporters, barons, knights, and church officials, who became his tenants-in-chief. In return for their land, these tenants were required to provide military service, pay taxes, and offer counsel to the king. This system of land tenure established a clear hierarchy, with the king at the top, followed by the barons and knights, and at the bottom, the peasants who worked the land. Peasants, or serfs, were bound to the land owned by their lord and were required to provide labor, crops, and services in exchange for protection and the right to work a small plot for their subsistence. This arrangement was both a form of economic organization and a means of social control, ensuring that the vast majority of the population remained dependent on the nobility and the crown. The role of the manor court and the administration of feudal justice. Central to the operation of the feudal system was the manor court, a local judicial body that dealt with a range of issues, from agricultural disputes to the enforcement of the lord's rights. The manor court was presided over by the lord or his appointed bailiff, and its decisions were binding on all the tenants of the manor. The manor court had jurisdiction over various aspects of village life. It handled disputes between tenants, such as disagreements over the use of common land, issues related to the maintenance of the manor's infrastructure, like roads and mills, and breaches of the peace. The court also enforced the agricultural calendar, ensuring that tasks such as planting and harvesting were carried out at the appropriate times. One of the manor court's primary functions was to uphold the lord's rights over his tenants. This included collecting rents, fines, and feudal dues, as well as ensuring that tenants fulfilled their obligations, such as working the lord's domain, the land retained by the lord for his own use, or providing military service. The bailiff, who oversaw the day-to-day running of the manor, played a crucial role in enforcing these obligations and managing the manor's economic activities. Punishments handed down by the manor court could range from fines and forfeiture of property to more severe penalties like corporal punishment. The court also had the power to impose amercements, fines that were often arbitrary and could be a significant burden on the poorer peasants. The manor court was a key institution in maintaining the feudal order, ensuring that the rights and privileges of the lord were protected while also providing a mechanism for resolving disputes among the tenants. Village life and the agricultural economy. Life in medieval England was predominantly rural, with the vast majority of the population living in small villages scattered across the countryside. These villages were typically organized around a manor, which served as the economic and administrative center of the local community. The landscape was dominated by fields, pastures, and woodlands, with agriculture forming the backbone of the economy. The agricultural system in medieval England was based on the open field system, where large fields were divided into strips that were farmed by individual peasants. These strips were usually allocated according to a system of rotation, ensuring that each peasant had access to both good and poor land. The open field system was communal in nature, with villagers working together on certain tasks, such as plowing, sowing, and harvesting. This communal approach helped to manage the risks associated with farming, such as bad weather or crop failure. Peasants in medieval England were divided into several categories based on their legal status and the nature of their obligations to the lord. The majority were serfs or villeins, who were bound to the land and required to work the lord's domain as part of their feudal obligations. Villeins were not free. They could not leave the manor without the lord's permission and were subject to various restrictions, such as the obligation to pay fines when their daughters married or when they inherited property. In contrast to villeins, there were also free peasants, known as freemen, who held their land independently and were not subject to the same level of feudal obligations. However, even freemen were not entirely free from the lord's authority, as they still had to pay rents and fulfill certain duties, such as participating in the manor court. The agricultural year was marked by a series of seasonal tasks, which dictated the rhythm of village life. In the spring, fields were plowed and sown with crops such as wheat, barley, and oats. The summer months were devoted to weeding and tending to the crops, while the harvest in late summer and early autumn was the most critical time of the year. The harvest was a communal effort, with all members of the village participating to ensure that the crops were gathered before the weather turned. After the harvest, the fields were prepared for the next planting season, and animals were brought in to graze on the stubble. The agricultural economy was vulnerable to a range of risks, including bad weather, poor harvests, and outbreaks of disease. Famine was a constant threat, particularly during the harsh winter months when food supplies were low. Peasants relied on a variety of strategies to cope with these challenges, such as storing surplus grain, practicing crop rotation, and supplementing their diet with foraged foods like nuts, berries, and wild herbs. The Forest Law and its impact on rural communities. In addition to the agricultural economy, the management of England's forests played a significant role in medieval life. Forests were not just areas of woodland, but also included open land, heath, and pasture, all of which were subject to the King's Forest Law. The Forest Law was a system of regulations designed to protect the royal hunting grounds, which were considered the exclusive preserve of the king and his nobles. Under the Forest Law, certain activities were heavily restricted or outright prohibited. Hunting deer, the most prized game, was strictly forbidden for anyone outside the nobility. Even the mere possession of a bow and arrow within a forest area could be grounds for punishment. The penalties for violating the Forest Law were severe and included fines, imprisonment, and in some cases, mutilation or death. The Forest Law had a significant impact on the rural communities that lived within or near the designated forest areas. These communities often depended on the forest for their livelihood, using it as a source of firewood, building materials, and grazing land for their animals. The restrictions imposed by the Forest Law made it difficult for peasants to access these resources, leading to tensions and conflicts with the authorities. The enforcement of the Forest Law was overseen by royal officials known as foresters and verdeers, who were responsible for maintaining the king's rights in the forest and prosecuting offenders. The harshness of the Forest Law and its enforcement made it deeply unpopular among the rural population, leading to widespread resentment and occasional uprisings. One of the most famous examples of resistance to the Forest Law is the legend of Robin Hood, who, according to popular folklore, was an outlaw who lived in Sherwood Forest and stole from the rich to give to the poor. While the historical accuracy of the Robin Hood legend is debated, it reflects the deep-seated grievances that many medieval peasants had against the Forest Law and the oppressive nature of the feudal system more broadly. Social hierarchy and the feudal nobility. The feudal system in medieval England was characterized by a rigid social hierarchy, with the king at the top, followed by the nobility, knights, and clergy, and at the bottom, the peasants who made up the vast majority of the population. This hierarchical structure was reflected in every aspect of life, from land ownership and governance to social customs and legal rights. The nobility played a central role in the feudal system, serving as the king's tenants-in-chief and acting as local lords over their own manors. These lords were responsible for maintaining law and order, administering justice, and defending their lands from external threats. In return for their services, the nobility were granted extensive privileges, including the right to collect taxes, levy troops, and dispense justice. Knights, who were often vassals of the nobility, formed the backbone of the feudal military system. In return for land or a stipend, knights were required to provide military service to their lord, which included participating in campaigns, defending the manor, and serving in the lord's retinue. Knights were also expected to uphold the code of chivalry, a set of ideals that emphasized bravery, loyalty, and honor. The clergy also held a privileged position within the feudal hierarchy. The church was a major landowner and played a crucial role in both the spiritual and temporal life of medieval England. Bishops and abbots were often members of the nobility and held significant political power, while parish priests served as the spiritual leaders of their local communities. The feudal system was not static, and social mobility, while limited, was possible. Ambitious individuals could rise through the ranks by acquiring land, marrying into a higher social class, or performing notable services for the king or a powerful lord. However, for the vast majority of the population, life was defined by their position within the feudal hierarchy, with little opportunity for upward mobility. Daily life and challenges for peasants. Life for peasants in medieval England was harsh and demanding. The majority of the population were engaged in subsistence agriculture, working long hours in the fields to produce enough food to feed their families and meet their obligations to their lord. The work was physically demanding and was dictated by the agricultural calendar, with periods of intense labor during the planting and harvest seasons. Peasants lived in small, simple houses made of wood, wattle, and daub, with thatched roofs and dirt floors. These homes were often shared with livestock, particularly during the winter months when animals were brought inside for warmth. The diet of peasants was simple and consisted mainly of bread, porridge, and vegetables, with meat being a rare luxury. Dairy products, eggs, and occasional fish supplemented their diet, and in times of scarcity, peasants would rely on foraging to survive. Seasonal food scarcity was a constant threat in medieval England, particularly during the winter and early spring when food stores were depleted and new crops had not yet been harvested. This period, known as the Hungry Gap, was a time of hardship for many rural communities. In bad years, when the harvest was poor, famine could strike, leading to malnutrition and increased mortality. In addition to the challenges of food scarcity, peasants were also vulnerable to disease. The medieval period was marked by frequent outbreaks of plague, smallpox, and other infectious diseases, which could decimate entire communities. The most devastating of these was the Black Death, which swept through England in 1348 to 1349, killing an estimated one-third of the population and leading to significant social and economic upheaval. Despite these challenges, peasants developed a rich communal life centered around the village. Festivals, religious observances, and communal activities such as the harvest were important aspects of village life, providing opportunities for socializing and reinforcing the bonds of community. The church played a central role in these activities, with the local parish church serving as the focal point of religious and social life. Education and social status in medieval England. Education in medieval England was largely the preserve of the church and the nobility. The majority of the population, particularly peasants, had little access to formal education and were largely illiterate. However, this began to change over the course of the medieval period, particularly in the later Middle Ages, when education became more widely available. The church was the primary provider of education in medieval England, with monasteries, cathedrals, and parish churches serving as centers of learning. Monastic schools, which were attached to monasteries, provided education for young boys who were training to become monks or priests. Cathedral schools, which were associated with major cathedrals, offered a more advanced education, often focusing on the liberal arts, theology, and the study of Latin. In addition to the church, there were also a small number of grammar schools, which provided education in Latin and the classical texts. These schools were often supported by local benefactors and were attended by boys from wealthy families who were preparing for careers in the church, law, or administration. The rise of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries marked a significant development in medieval education. The University of Oxford, founded in the late 12th century, and the University of Cambridge, founded in the early 13th century, became important centers of learning, attracting students from across Europe. These universities offered a curriculum based on the study of the liberal arts, theology, law, and medicine, and were instrumental in the development of a more educated and professional class. While education was still largely restricted to the elite, there were signs of increasing social mobility in the later Middle Ages. The Black Death, which had a profound impact on the population and economy of England, led to a labor shortage that increased the bargaining power of peasants and contributed to the decline of serfdom. This, in turn, created opportunities for some individuals to improve their social status through trade, land ownership, or service to the crown. By the end of the medieval period, the rigid social hierarchy of the feudal system was beginning to break down, paving the way for the social and economic changes that would characterize the early modern period. The decline of feudalism and the rise of a centralized state. The decline of feudalism in medieval England was a gradual process that was influenced by a range of social, economic, and political factors. While the feudal system remained the dominant social structure for much of the medieval period, by the 15th century, it was beginning to be challenged by the rise of a more centralized and bureaucratic state. One of the key factors in the decline of feudalism was the increasing importance of money in the economy. As trade and commerce expanded, the cash economy began to replace the traditional system of land-based obligations. This shift allowed lords to collect rents in money rather than in labor or crops, which in turn reduced the peasants' dependence on their lords and undermined the feudal relationship. The Black Death also played a significant role in the decline of feudalism. The dramatic reduction in population led to a labor shortage, which increased the bargaining power of peasants and led to demands for higher wages and better working conditions. In response, many lords began to commute labor services into cash payments, further weakening the traditional feudal ties. The Wars of the Roses, a series of dynastic conflicts between the houses of Lancaster and York, also contributed to the decline of feudalism. The wars, which took place between 1455 and 1485, weakened the power of the nobility and led to the centralization of royal authority. The rise of powerful monarchs such as Henry VII, who established the Tudor dynasty in 1485, marked the beginning of a new era in English history, characterized by a stronger, more centralized state. By the end of the medieval period, the feudal system was in decline, and England was on the brink of significant social, economic, and political changes. The rise of a centralized state, the expansion of trade and commerce, and the emergence of a more educated and professional class all contributed to the transformation of medieval England from an agricultural feudal society to one on the brink of creating an empire. Conclusion. Life in medieval England under the feudal system was shaped by a complex interplay of social, economic, and political forces. The feudal system, introduced by William the Conqueror in 1066, created a hierarchical society in which land ownership and social status were closely intertwined. The manor court and the forest law played key roles in maintaining the feudal order, while the agricultural economy provided the foundation for the lives of the majority of the population. Despite the harsh conditions and challenges faced by peasants, medieval England was a society characterized by a rich communal life, deeply rooted in the rhythms of the agricultural calendar and the traditions of the church. Education and social status were closely linked, with limited opportunities for social mobility, though this began to change in the later Middle Ages. The decline of feudalism and the rise of a centralized state in the 15th century marked the end of the medieval period and the beginning of a new era in English history. The social, economic, and political transformations that took place during this time laid the groundwork for the emergence of England as a powerful and centralized state, poised to expand its influence and create an empire. By examining the lives of different social classes, the role of key institutions, and the broader historical context, we have gained a greater understanding of what life was like in medieval England under the feudal system. The legacy of this period, with its profound impact on English society and the development of the modern state, continues to be felt to this day. Thanks for listening. Like and comment. And please subscribe, as that will help us get more videos out to those interested in the Middle Ages. See you next time on Medieval Chronicles 1066. Stay curious.